Hello, and welcome to Historical Geography in the Holy Land. Today we'll be talking about Unit 4, and we'll be presenting on Jesus' life and ministry in Galilee and Judea. So we'll be moving through the various sites that are mentioned in the Bible that Jesus visited or lived in or traveled through during his ministry. This is the final presentation in this series. So some of the topics that we'll be covering are Jesus' youth and ministry in Galilee, his public ministry in Galilee, his public ministry in Judea, and then his last days in Jerusalem. Beginning with Jesus' youth and ministry in Galilee. Jesus was born sometime during the time of a census that was taken by Quirinius. And this is referenced in the Gospel of Luke in chapters 2, verse 2. And it's also again mentioned in the book of Acts in chapter 5, verse 37. In the Roman Empire, the census would occur every 14 years. And this is documented in several of the ancient papyrus and also noted by the ancient historians, such as Josephus. It was an official decree of Caesar Augustus, according to the Gospel of Luke. So it places the event around the year 9 BCE. Now, Bethlehem is a place of birth for Jesus is not being disputed. The historian Jerome shows evidence of a cave in Bethlehem, which has been located under the present Church of the Nativity. The Emperor Constantine and his mother Helena had a church built over the cave, as recorded by Eusebius. Today's excavations actually show remains of this Constantinian era church. It's in the traditional shape of a shrine. It's an octagonal building right above the cave. So not only do we have a holy shrine, but we have also the basilica, which served as a meeting place for Christians. This twofold pattern of buildings is something that is copied from the Roman emperors when they would build their mausoleums. And we find it being used in early Christian churches built in honor of their martyrs. The Byzantine Empire lasted approximately 1,000 years, from 330 BCE all the way up to 1453, the Common Era, when it falls to the Ottomans. So here we have the location of Bethlehem. And some key sites that we'll be looking at are Nazareth, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem. This is the Church of Nativity. And an inside of what the actual church looks like. And notice it's built in the basilica style with the apse, with a central aisle and two centers, two side aisles. This is the interior, and this area here looks down into the grotto below. Now, St. Jerome was a translator of the Latin Vulgate Bible, which was commissioned by Pope Damascus I in 382 CE. So St. Jerome actually moves to Bethlehem in 385, and he lives in a cave that's next to the birth grotto until his death 35 years later. And this is while he's translating the Septuagint into the Latin. Here's the entrance to the birth grotto, the cave entry. And again, this is from the inside of the Church of the Nativity. Now, Nazareth is relatively unimportant little village, and we see that noted in the Gospel of John in chapter 1, verse 46. It's a small agricultural settlement. In the remains there, we find wine presses, olive presses, caves for storing grain, cisterns for water and wine. There's actually pottery that has been found that dates back to the Iron Age too, which is 900 to 600 BCE, all the way through the Byzantine era, 330 to 640 CE. So the location has been occupied for a very long time. There are Roman pieces that they've discovered during excavations, which date back to the time period of Christ. In the location, they've also found 23 tombs, which designate the limits of the town, because tombs were located outside of towns during the Hellenistic and the Roman era. The first church built in Nazareth was by Joseph Tiberius, who was a rich Jew who converted to Christianity and was actually given permission to build on site. Permission had to be given to build churches in that area of Galilee by Emperor Constantine. They've also discovered the location of a Jewish Christian synagogue, which dates back to the 3rd century, and there's an excavation that's been done for this, which was found below the floor of the Annunciation Church. And there's a reference to that particular synagogue where both Jews and Christians met in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4. So at this point, we've moved from Bethlehem and we're up here in the small village of Nazareth. This is the Church of Annunciation. This is a lower grotto within the church. And of course, the upper church basilica. It's a very large complex. Now we have the beginnings of the public ministry of Jesus. In the Gospel of Luke, in chapters 3, verses 1 through 2, it tells us the start of Jesus's ministry in Galilee, and it takes place in 27 CE. We're told Lysania is a tetrarch in Abila near Damascus during this time. The baptism of Jesus's ministry begins with his baptism by John in the Jordan River, as we read about it in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 28. John the Baptist, also known as John the Dipper, probably was somehow connected with the Qumran community, a group of Essenes, very conservative and who have separated themselves from the Pharisees and Sadducees in Jerusalem and moved further out into the desert area to be closer to God and his word, and to follow the scriptures much more rigidly. So at one time there are, it's thought that John may have actually been raised by the Essenes in the Qumran community, because they would frequently take in orphans, and John's parents were older when they had him, so they may have passed away when he was quite young and been raised by that community. So we find John following many of the let's see, how do we say this? The religious behaviors and rituals of that community and of the Jewish community at large, including the mikvah, those ritual baths and immersions. John uses the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah's wordings in chapter 40, verse 3, for the justification of his preaching in the wilderness of Judea. Both John and that community at Qumran live and work in the wilderness of Judea, which is a narrow strip of desert along the southern Jordan. Now, John, known as the Dipper, would immerse in water those who accept his teachings. This was typical in the Qumran community, and it goes along with the Jewish use of the mikvah, that ritual bath of immersion. So John expands the understanding of baptism. For him, it's not just a ritual cleaning, it's much more of a change of life, a turning away from sin. So he has this full immersion within the Jordan River, something that would be life-changing rather than the continuous ritualistic cleansing that the Jewish people practice with the mikvot. John's diet included locust, which is not unique. That was common fare for people in that part of the world. And it was eaten regularly at the Qumran community. And the locust is actually considered a clean insect per Leviticus laws. So here we have, in this map, the Qumran community was located here by the Dead Sea. And of course, you can see the extent of the Jordan River. So somewhere on this area, probably most likely closer to the Dead Sea, is where the baptism of Jesus would have taken place. So this along that Jordan River that John was baptizing. Now, as you can see from this view, the Jordan River is very lush and green, and it meanders through a variety of geography, different climates, lush to drier. And this would be much closer to the Dead Sea area. And probably it was something like this scene that you see in front of you, in terms of the topography and the land and the dryness, where the baptism of Jesus would have taken place. Now, in Israel itself, all along the Jordan River, you'll find baptismal spots, which are very popular with tourists who make a Holy Land pilgrimage. What we're looking at now is an aerial view of the Qumran community. It's been excavated quite extensively, and it's a great site to visit on a pilgrimage tour. This is the mikvot, one of the mikvots at the Qumran community. This one has been damaged by an earthquake, and I believe I shared this picture in an earlier presentation. When you enter the mikvot, you would enter with a clean set of clothes that you would put on, that would be set aside, so that when you enter one way down the stairs, you do full immersion 3 times, you recite the Psalms, and then you come up on the opposite side and then dress into clean clothes. So you're now have been purified to enter into a holy site or a time of prayer. The temptation of Jesus occurs after his baptism by John the Baptist. And at this point, Jesus is in the wilderness, and he's experiencing the temptations of Satan. And we have references to the event in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So due west of Jericho is the wilderness of Judea. There's also a mountain there called, well, it's more like a very large hill, called the Mount of the 40, or Jebel Karanta. And this is where it's believed that those 40 days of temptation that Jesus endured took place. One of the temptations, it's thought to have taken place at the pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem, most likely where the royal porch is, the southeast corner of the temple. So here we have Jebel Korantal, which is the Mount of 40, talking about the 40 days of temptations of Christ. And there's a monastery that's actually built into the side of the mountain. The public ministry of Jesus continues in the area of Galilee. So once he's past the temptations, he now proceeds moving forward, and he comes to Capernaum. So after his rejection in his home town in Nazareth, Jesus proceeds to live in Capernaum, which is located on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. And he lives with Simon Peter. Jesus teaches and performs healings in a synagogue in that city, we're told in the Gospel of Mark and also in John. Capernaum is now referred to as Tel Hum. It's one of the best known sites in the Holy Land, and it's important to both Jews and Christians. So here we have Capernaum, right in this area by the Sea of Galilee. We're going to take a look at, there's a synagogue. There's actually two synagogues that are located to what we believe are the remains of St. Peter's house. There's one that's built of thick black basalt. The walls are 4 feet thick, and it's divided into 3 areas. So you have that central nave and 2 narrow aisles, and that we believe actually dates back to the time of Jesus, would be the synagogue that Jesus would have been going to preach on a daily basis. And next to that is near that is a later date synagogue, which is made of white stone. So this is the more current synagogue. And you can see the design here with the central nave and the 2 narrow aisles. And this is the remains of the basaltic ruins, a much older synagogue, which they date back to the time of Jesus, next to the house of St. Peter. Now, close to the synagogue, about not too far in distance, they found the remains of an octagonal Byzantine church. Again, that's very symbolic of Queen Helen and Constantine's era. And next, and near that is another square structure with a central hall, which they believe is the actual house. So this octagonal Byzantine church actually sits on top of this central house. Most probably, they strongly believe it's the actual house of Simon Peter. It has thinner walls which could have supported a wood roof, typical of that time. And those kind of roofs would have been easy to actually make a hole through to lower someone down. For example, the cripple that was mentioned in the Gospel of Mark. And then, of course, there are roofs which are made so that you could actually pray on top of them. So on the site, they found a round oven in the courtyard. And at a later date, at some point later in time, when the house became so heavily occupied with Christians, it became a meeting area and no longer a home. The roof was actually raised. And they find all sorts of graffiti on the walls, referring to Simon Peter and Christ. There are storage jars and oil lamps found on the site. And then the house had become a church, one which was venerated as the house of St. Peter. So these are the ruins. See, it's a very unique identifier in terms of that octagonal shape of the shrine that was placed over and identified the house of Simon Peter. And so the church itself is actually built over that particular shrine. And now you're looking at what you can see if you look underneath the flooring. So the church is lifted up so you can actually see what's underneath it. Not only that, but when you enter into the church itself, it has a glass floor so you can look down into the shrine. So that first picture, this one, was actually taken before St. Peter's Church was actually built above it. And you can see the view here. And once you're in the church, you have a beautiful view of the Sea of Galilee. Now, Gergesa is one of the spots where Jesus performs miracles. It's 9 miles from Capernaum, on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And there they found an ancient church next to an unexcavated Tel. Tel El Kursi is the name of that particular Tel. And next to the spot, there's a small bay by this harbor. It's very strongly felt that this is the site where the demon did the exorcism, where Jesus did the exorcism of the demoniac, and he exorcised all those demons out of the demoniac, who was filled with a legion of demons, into the pigs, who then ran into the water and drowned. There are several reasons to support this particular location versus several others in the area. One is that the historian Eusebius actually noted the location, Gergesa, where the Lord healed the demons. And it's a village located on a mountain by the sea. There was a Byzantine church that was actually built on the site, very lavish, which indicates that it's an important Christian place, or that some key event took place there. There's also a very large boulder within a monastic compound, which is an indication, sort of like marking the spot where a miracle would have taken place. In this case, Jesus exorcising the demons out of the man. And then we also have the exorcism of the demons into the herd swine on the other side of the sea. And this part of Galilee was called the Decapolis, and it was very much a Hellenistic area with strong Greek and Roman influences, a lot of pagan worships taking place, and they were comfortable eating pork and raising swine, which is something that was against the Jewish laws, dietary laws. The pigs, we're told, run off a steep bank and fall into the sea and drown. And so again, the location helps support these events that are recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There are tombs nearby. There's a cliff nearby which would allow the swine to run off and fall into the sea. There are several names that are given to this miraculous site, which is why it's created some confusion as to where the location exactly was of this village. It's called Gergesa, Gadara, and Gerasa. But the only one that actually fits the geography with the swine running into the water is Gergesa. So we have several different locations with different names. So here's Gergesa, right here by the edge of the Sea of Galilee, and then you have Gadara and Gamala, and so those different names, depending on the translation, is where the discussion took place. But realistically, the likelihood of the correct location would be, most probable location would be Gergesa. So at the site, you find the remains of this Byzantine basilica. Notice the apse. And the ornate mosaic tiles. The next location is Bethsaida. And this is a place where we believe Jesus fed the 5,000 with fishes and loaves, which is recorded in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There have, over the centuries, been a different identification of location sites for where this event took place. We know it would have occurred on the eastern side of the sea, since Jesus return to the other side, is what we're told when we're reading closely the biblical record of his movements. And then Jesus and the disciples landed later at Gennesaret on the western side. So after the feeding, there's a storm at sea, as recorded in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew and John. And most likely the masses then would have been fed somewhere near Bethsaida Julius, an area which is on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, as noted in John and also the Gospel of Luke. So today, this place is referred to as El Araj, and it would have been on the western side of the Jordan in the time of antiquity. The boats used by Jesus and his disciples, there's actually one example that's been found from the first century CE, and it measures 26 feet long by 7 feet wide. It would hold about 15 average-sized men of this time. The average height for a man would have been around 5'5". They weighed about 140 pounds in weight. Normally, such a boat would have one mast and 2 oars on each side. And beyond that, there's very little information in regards to the actual site. The tell that's there has not been excavated. So this would be Bethsaida here, this location. This is a cobblestone road leading into that area. And it's got to be a large enough plain that you could have 5,000 people, men, along with their wives and children in attendance, being able to sit to listen to Jesus present his message. So the Roman coins found in Bethsaida. You can see this is a pagan idolatrous figure that's found in the site. Now, in regards to Chorazin, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke record that Jesus cursed 3 cities at the time. And they were Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Chorazin. Chorazin is also noted as Kirbet Keraza. It's located about 2.5 miles north of Capernaum. So here we have Chorazin, one of the villages that was cursed. So you've got Chorazin, Capernaum, and Bethsaida, all 3 of them. Jesus spent a lot of time in these villages. He did a lot of miracles, and yet at the end, they did not listen or follow the message that he gave them. This is an olive press that was found at the village of Chorazin. In a first century synagogue, Jesus always took his message to the Jews, so he would visit the synagogues in all these different locations and bring the good news of God's kingdom to them first. From Chorazin, we're moving into Caesarea Philippi, which is one of the northernmost towns in Galilee that was visited by Jesus. It's at Caesarea Philippi that Simon Peter makes his confession of Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God. We find that recorded in Matthew, Mark, and also Luke. It's a city that was built by Philip, one of Herod the Great's son. Josephus, the historian Josephus notes that Philip built Caesarea Philippi near Panias, which is where a sacred cave is located with a very deep pool, and it's a cultic worship site of the Roman god Pan. The area was further enlarged by Agrippa, who renamed it Neronius in honor of the Emperor Nero. Today, the modern name of that site by the Arabs is Banias. They tend to pronounce it with a B. And there's a beautiful nature preserve that's located there. At Caesarea Philippi, It's often considered by the Romans at that time to have been a gateway to the underworld. And it's there that Jesus shows the dominion of God over the pagan deities. And he gives the keys to the kingdom to Peter and the apostles, supporting their emerging rock-like faith, which will overcome anything. And so in the Gospel of Matthew, we have this wording that comes out from Jesus to Peter when he acknowledges who Jesus is. And so I say to you, you are Peter. So Simon gets renamed Peter, Petra for rock. And upon this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. And so you can understand the imagery now, because he's standing before that cave, which was considered a gate to the underworld. And when he says, I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So Caesarea Philippi is up here by Tel Dan, and we're looking at the headwaters coming out of the Mount Hermon, creating the Jordan River, close to that area. It's a lush, very beautiful nature preserve. And this is the cave that we're referring to. And so this whole site is a preserve for the god Pan. These niches would hold images of the god Pan or other deities. It was a regularly visited and very popular site, so much so that eventually it would become an administrative area in order to manage all the monies that were being brought in to support the worship of this deity. So here's an example of actually during the time of Jesus, it was an administrative center, probably built up to this point. It wasn't yet a full-fledged city. It would become that in 70 CE. But a lot of activity would take place here. And all these people are coming to worship these pagan deities. And in the midst of all this, Simon Peter acknowledges Jesus as Christ, the true Messiah, the Son of God. So a very strong statement of faith. Cana of Galilee is a place where Jesus performed the first miracle of his ministry, and we read about that in the Gospel of John. It's located about 5 miles northeast of Nazareth. On the road toward Cana of Galilee, there are located 2 churches. One is Greek and one is Roman Catholic. And both actually claim to preserve traditions that are relative to that place of the miracle. In other words, they're claiming this is where that miracle took place, where the water was changed into wine. The first century date for the findings under the Roman Church have never been established. More likely, the actual site of Cana is located at Khirbet Cana, and that means the ruins of Cana. That's approximately 9 miles north of Nazareth. And on that site, we find some quite impressive ruins and large walls which are still standing, and surface findings which include Roman potsherds, which are typical from the time of Jesus. So here we have Cana, where the miracle of the water into wine took place. So here's the Greek church that's in that area, and the Roman Catholic, both of them claiming that the site of the miracle took place where they're at. It's the interior of the Roman church. This is a replica. Well, it's not a replica. This is actually an ancient wine jar. Notice this one is made out of stone, non-porous. And this is, again, supports the concept that the ancient Cana site is actually at Khirbet Cana, and there's evidence to that, but the tell itself hasn't been excavated. We just have ruins, the standing walls, and some Roman shards, which all date back to the time of Jesus. So surface findings, but no significant excavation has taken place at this point in time. So here we are going down into Khirbet Cana. Now, Sepphoris is an ancient city which Josephus refers to as the city, the ornament of Galilee. It's a beautiful city which, after Herod the Great, fell into a district that was governed by his son Herod Antipas, and Herod Antipas rebuilt the city. So the city actually has a very large Jewish population, and Sepphoris becomes the capital of Galilee, becomes the city of the royal bank and also the archives. During the rebuilding of the city, it's very likely that Jesus and his father Joseph, who worked as carpenters or construction workers in the area, they would have gone back and forth being employed in the location of the city while it was being rebuilt. It's only 3 miles distance from Nazareth. So here we have Sepphoris, an aerial view of this very much a large city built on the Roman designs of a city that would accommodate a mixed population. Excavations of the area, which is a very large tell, and parts of it have been excavated, not all of it, reflects that this city was so large it actually expanded into the valleys. There's a Christian basilica, which dates back to the 4th century Common Era. There's part of a theater, which was built in the Herodian period. There are Hasmonean coins found there. So the city has a long history of being populated. There are 39 underground caves and cisterns, again indicating a large population. You would have to be able to have water backed up in order to support these the population, and also the Roman baths and the Jewish baths. They apparently were a large number of Jewish mikvahs to support the large Jewish population that lived on site. There's also indications of a Jewish Christian sect called the Ebionites, who would meet underground in these secret dwellings, these underground caves. By the 2nd century, before the Common Era, before there was a large, apparently there was a large Jewish population there. It's during this time that Judah HaNasi actually began the codification of the Mishnah, the oral Torah, which was codified. There's a beautiful and extravagant mosaic tiles, which and there's a panel that was discovered which reflected the wealth of the community and the god that was worshipped there, the Greco-Roman god Dionysus. The church ruins at Sepphoris. One of the mikvot remains. Mikvot. Oh yeah, okay, so I skipped this one is the Roman theater and the church and the mikvot. And here we have the famous Jewel of the Galilee. This is a beautiful mosaic in Galilee. There's actually a wonderful DVD presentation on the excavation and discovery of this particular mural. And when you pour water on it, the colors really come out. So a beautiful depiction of this woman. She's considered the Mona Lisa of the Galilee. The next site we're visiting is Tiberias. It's mentioned Once in the New Testament Gospels, we find it mentioned in the Gospel of John in chapter 6. Today, Tiberias actually covers two ancient sites, Tiberias and Hamath. They were actually one city in the first century Common Era. Herod Antipas built Tiberias to serve as his capital, and it would replace Sepphoris. There are several synagogues that have been excavated in the area, so indicating a large Jewish population. There's a paved road and a city gate, all from the time dating back to the time of Herod Antipas. So we go from Tiberias, from Sepphoris to Tiberias. These are some of the excavations that have been taken place at Tiberias. This is an intriguing mosaic. It's a wealthy Jewish community, and so you see the menorahs, but they also have Gentile patrons, as you see this astrological sign mixed in with this very Jewish symbolism within a synagogue. We have more of the synagogue excavations. You see the menorah here, the engraving on the stone there. At Sitjar, there's some activity by Jesus in this area. It's located in Samaria, and so there are very strong feelings of hostility between Jews and Samaritans, so you don't see a lot of crossing into that territory. But we do have that conversation of Jesus with the woman at the well of Jacob, and we have references that in the Gospel of John. So Sitjar is located in the eastern part of Nablus. The well, at different points in time, was covered with a vault of cut stones, and that was seen by pilgrim travelers during the 19th century. That vault of cut stones has now disappeared. The well and the area itself was bought by the Greek Orthodox Church in 1885. It's a very deep well, and that's also noted in the Gospel of John, just how deep the well is. The site itself is one that is agreed upon by Jews, Christians, and Muslims as a location to where Jesus conversed with the Samaritan women. So it's a very important religious site. Pilgrims travel to the site, and there are many records of it in pilgrim diaries and journals, including the Bordeaux pilgrim who kept a diary back in 333 Common Era as to having visited that well. So it has a long recorded history of being in existence. There's a large limestone block that covers the well, and there's a small hole through which the water is actually drawn out, and so that keeps the well water clean. And we know that after talking with Jesus, the woman then returned to her village of Sitjar, and she shared the good news of Jesus with those in the village. So we have Sitjar in this area, and note Mount Gerizim, which is where the Samaritans built a temple. So it's at today that village of Askar is actually situated on Mount Ebal, and Jesus would have seen the people coming from the village as he sat by the well, and he says to his disciples, "Look at this potential harvest." So it's a very critical moment for the disciples to understand that the Word of God is inclusive, not exclusive, just for the Jews alone. So here we have Jacob's well, and if you visit the sites, you can even drink water from this well. And this is Mount Ebal, where that temple, the site of the Samaritan temple, where and there was an altar of sacrifices, which was destroyed by the Israelites when they were brought back from the exile. It was considered an abomination to the Jewish faith because there's a history of the Samaritans having intermingled with the Jews that remained while the rest of the Jews were exiled. So there was some changes that were made to the Jewish faith, which they adopted. And so when they built this other temple, it was considered a blasphemous act on the part of conservative Jews. Now we're moving into Jesus's ministry in the area of Judea. So let's take a look at his public ministry in Judea. Now, most of Jesus's ministry took place in Galilee, but we have gospel that record an occasional visit to the area of Judea. So we'll look at the pool of Bethsaida, which Jesus visits in Judea, and he heals an invalid at this pool. And there's evidence of this pool. It's actually found also recorded in the copper scroll in Qumran back in the time frame of 25 CE. The Hebrew name Beth Estayan may mean also the house of twin pools, which is located near the Temple Mount's northern wall. And we have two large pools cut out of rock and plastered, and they have columns which could have belonged to the 5 porches that are mentioned in the Gospel of John. This was constructed by Simon the Just in the 3rd century BCE, and the pools themselves were fed by rainwater and underground springs. Eusebius refers to them as the sheep pool. The Bordeaux Pilgrim, writing in the 4th century, also mentions the twin pools. So a long history of the existence of these pools. So here we are back in the area of Judea, and now we're in Jerusalem. The pool of Bethsaida. And John tells us the invalid is near the pool and the steps around which people are gathered, but they're preventing him, this invalid, from entering the water when it bubbles. And apparently the belief was that when the water was stirred up and bubbling like that, the angels were present. So you needed to, in order to be healed, you needed to enter the water at that moment in time, and then you could be healed. The pool of Siloam, Jesus is where Jesus heals the blind man. He puts clay on the blind man's eyes, and then he tells him to wash his eyes in the water so that he could see. This is recorded in the Gospel of John. This pool was built by King Hezekiah in the 8th century BCE, and he built a long tunnel to bring water from the Gihon spring to the pool, which he had located inside the city walls. That was critical, particularly when the city was under siege or attack by, for example, the Assyrians and later the Babylonians. Now, over time, the pool has shrunk, but once it was surrounded by a colonnaded portico, and later in 1897, a mosque was actually built in the area. So here you have the pool of Siloam in Jerusalem. These are the steps to enter into the pool. And here in Sidon, these are both Gentile cities. They're port cities. And Jesus visits this, toward the end of his ministry, he visits this Gentile territory. And we have this mentioned in the Gospels of Matthew and also Mark. And it's the territory of Syria and Phoenicia, which today would be modern Lebanon. And Jesus intends to preach to Jews as he goes into the area, but he stops and he heals this Gentile woman's daughter because he's so impressed with her faith, as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, the area of Tyre, we find many Roman remains, a well-built-up port city, a monumental arch which dates back to the 2nd century CE. There are Roman roads lined with tombs. It has a hippodrome, a large bathhouse, and a forum. So all of the markings of a well-established Roman city, which would have had a very mixed population, a lot of pagan and Hellenistic influence. In the area of Sidon, which is another port city, we have tombs that date back all the way to the 4th century BCE. And also there we find writings on some of these tombs, which talk about the Korban, that vow of Korban. And that's a religious offering that's made in fulfillment of a vow to God. So many times these tomb inscriptions were made to deter robbers. Like if you're giving this offering to God in fulfillment of a vow, then if you were to open it or break it open and steal from it, you would experience the wrath of God. So it was to put that fear into anyone who would try to attempt and break in. So here are the port cities of Tyre and Sidon. And it's because of the wealth that comes in and out of these port cities that Herod the Great actually decided to build his own port, which was Caesarea Maritima. But Jesus goes and visits these two port cities. Now notice where Tel Dan is. So he's way up there in the north. I mean, he travels quite extensively during the time he's preaching and teaching and sharing his good news. It's a Roman arch at Tyre. And you have some temple ruins. Again, a reminder that this is a Roman city. It's not just the Jews who are residing here. A lot of columns. Moving into the last day of Jesus, we come to Bethany. And so now Jesus is heading toward the Passion Week and about to enter into Jerusalem. So before Jesus's last Passover, he goes to Bethany, where Martha, Mary, and Lazarus live. And it's here that he raises Lazarus from death, as noted in the Gospel of John. Now, Bethany is today a modern village. It's 2 miles from Jerusalem. It's located east of the slopes of Mount Olivet. And there's actually what is referred to as the tomb of Lazarus, and it's located behind a modern church building. The tomb is very small. There's no way to tell if it was the actual tomb of Lazarus. However, the construction beneath the current church dates all the way back to the 4th century Common Era, and it includes crosses and stonework. So the site has been visited as a pilgrimage site for over 1,500 years. So here we have the village of Bethany, where the tomb of Lazarus is located as Jesus begins to make his final journey into Jerusalem. And notice Mount Olivet in this location. The Church of St. Lazarus, and that's the tomb is located next to that tomb area. And this is where you would enter into the tomb of Lazarus. It's really narrow, steep, and dark. And usually there's quite a bit of a line to enter in and take a look at it. So you're going down those steps. Dominus Flevit Church. Jesus makes his entry into Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, and the place where he wept, halfway down the mountain, is marked by a chapel and it's a Franciscan chapel called Dominus Flavus, which means the Lord wept. And excavations beneath the chapel have located ruins of a Byzantine church, and also graves that are built in the traditional Jewish style from the period of 70 CE. There are crosses and monograms found and engraved, and several ossuaries with over 43 inscriptions with names which are very familiar in the New Testament era, including names such as Miriam, Yeshua, Judas, and Matthew. So here we have Dominus Flavit Church. You can see its location halfway down Mount Olives. These are the ossuaries that they found within there, and they have those common names like we read in the New Testament of Mary, Joseph, Jacob. Now, if we head further down the Mount of Olives, west of this Dominus Flavit Church, we come to Gethsemane and the Church of All Nations. This church was built on a Byzantine church, which marked the spot of the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus prayed on a rock, which is now actually in front of the apse of this church. And we read about Jesus praying there at the Garden of Gethsemane on this rock in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So here it is, the Church of All Nations. The interior of the Church of All Nations. Look at the beautiful ceiling there and the colors. And this is the small garden that still exists today. The trees are several hundreds of years old. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, they actually burned all of this, and the trees were replanted after that sacking of Jerusalem. And here's the rock on which Jesus prayed. Again, it's within the church confines itself. Now, the palace of Caiaphas. So after Jesus was arrested, he was taken to Ananias, who was the former high priest, and his son-in-law Caiaphas's home. And Caiaphas was the high priest during this time. And we see records of this in the Gospels of John, and also in several of the other Gospels as to what takes place. And we find these stone steps on the northern side of what is now the modern church, which covers this area, called St. Peter of the Cockcrow. And these are the steps that would have led to the house of the high priest. So these are the steps that Jesus would have gone up along with St. Peter. And in addition to that, we have the Madaba map of the Holy Land, which dates back to the reign of Justinian, 560 CE, and it helps us in locating the Byzantine church that was actually found beneath the St. Peter of the Cockcrow. So it helps identify that, yes, that church was actually there, the one that the newer church sits upon. So you see layers and layers upon layers of these churches and of these shrines, indicating this holy site over the century that people have continued to visit as pilgrims. So here is the modern day St. Peter's Cockcrow Church, and there's actually a rooster on top of the church. This is the interior of the church itself. There's a rooster. See that up there? Okay. And so we have Caiaphas, who was the Sadducee, involved with the trial of Jesus. This is his home, and so we have this scene that takes place depicting what is happening. And so these are the steps to the city and also Caiaphas's residence. So the wall in the lower level of the house, when you enter into the excavation site, indicates that there were shackles and chains at one time on one of the walls, and that's where they would have taken Jews and beaten them for blasphemy to the faith. So here we have the Madaba map, which was discovered in Jordan, and it helps locate these different locations. So you've got Pardo Maximus, you've got the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and let's see. And this is a great example that tells us what the different locations are. So later on, we're going to look at the cenacle, which is where the Last Supper would have taken place. Here we've got the sheep pool. And so this map helps validate the location of these different churches and places where key events took place during the life of Jesus. See here we've got in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they're showing where the martyrdom took place too. So the Church of the Apostles, we find sits on top of the remains of what was a Jewish Christian synagogue. And in it we find also like a wall niche, which would have been a typical spot for holding Torah scrolls. So we know that it was considered at some time to be recorded as an early Judeo-Christian area where people met. And so there's strong evidence that this site was the site of the Last Supper. And so it was built upon there and where the Pentecost visitation took place, where Peter preached the Pentecost sermon. So the room where the apostles prayed then when they returned from Mount Olives after Christ ascended into heaven. So this is the interior ruins of the Jewish Christian synagogue. And this is the cenacle, which is the other name for the room of the Last Supper. Of course, this has all been rebuilt since the original room, but this is where a lot of this dates back to the Crusader era. Then we have mosaic flooring. Thousands of crucifixions took place during the Roman era and before. However, to date, we have only one actual victim of crucifixion having been discovered, because what would happen is victims of crucifixion were normally shunned by their families. People didn't go back to collect them. They would be fearful of the Roman retaliation. And so the bodies, once they died, were brought down and tossed frequently into the Valley of Hinnom, referred to as Gehenna, which was the local city dump. And there were small fires and different animals would go through and ravage the remains. In this instance, the father came back and collected his son's body. And then after a year in the tomb, the bones were then placed into a bone box, also known as an ossuary. So when that box was opened, it was discovered that the body inside had actually been a victim of crucifixion. And it's a Jewish male dating back to the 1st century. He was aged about approximately between 24 to 28 years old, probably 5'6" in height. And so it's an example for us of what was involved in the crucifixion. There were actually many different methods of crucifixion. Death, what actually kills the individual is shock from the loss of blood, and strangulation due to a lack of oxygen, because the individual couldn't raise themselves up because if their feet were nailed or tied down to the cross so that they could get oxygen into their lungs. So this is the actual bone that of the man that was crucified. You can see the nail in it, and this is a replica of what it would have looked like when it was intact. Roman nails were made of iron. They were approximately 5 to 7 inches in length, and they would often be reused for following crucifixions. It's a close-up of the pierced bone. These are nails from the crucifixion. Interestingly enough, in the ossuary of Caiaphas, they actually found the two Roman nails, and there's a whole DVD on this behind the finding of the Roman nails and what their meaning could be, which is fascinating. Crucifixion has been around a long time. It was in place well before the Romans. The Persians also practiced crucifixion. Crucified victims usually were nailed outside of the city on the road leading into the city as a reminder to everyone to behave themselves. They were under the subjugation of an empire, and if they were to rebel against that emperor, this would be the resultant punishment. So it was a good warning, deterrent for anyone who was thinking of creating problems. So in regards to the burial place of Christ, two different sites are worshipped. One is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, also known as Holy Resurrection Church. Now, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre originally started outside of the city walls, which would make sense because it would have been a site of crucifixion and also a place of burial, which would not have been allowed within the city walls. And there's a lot of evidence to support that this actually was the site. Originally there was a lime quarry there. It was later filled in and made into a garden. And Constantine's mother, very early on, came to the site and placed a shrine and then had a church built. And there's a strong literary witness from memory of the location of the tomb, including the Christian bishops in Jerusalem. So there's a lot of history to help support that this was the actual site. So here we have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's a very large building because it grew to accommodate both where the crucifixion took place and where the burial took place. It was burned down and rebuilt. And so you see the different results of that building over time. Here's the entrance to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There's a lot of history to this. Inside, there are many different sects of the Catholic faith which claim dominion over different parts of the church. Here we have the chapel that is visited of the Holy Sepulchre. And that's the stairway up to Calvary, where the chapel is located and where the crucifixion would have taken place. This is the stone of unction where Jesus' body is believed to have been laid out. And this is the tomb of what we believe is Joseph Arimathea, where Jesus' bones would have been placed a year later, if that had been the case. But as we know, Jesus, we have the wonder of the resurrection. So this is what the inside of a typical first century tomb looks like. So everything about the site makes sense and is credible in terms of what would have taken place during the burial of Jesus. So the style of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is correct. is early Roman. We have the Constantine era round monument shrine, which depicts it as a worshiping site. And then we have a basilica that was also built over the area. The second site is the Garden Tomb, also known as Gordon's Tomb. And this was built, named after an English, I believe is an army officer, who saw this mountain and this burial area, and there was a shape of a skull there. So he thought very strongly that this was the actual site of the burial. And so it became a pilgrimage site also. It's actually located 100 yards outside of the Damascus Gate. It's an unlikely location. The date and the time of the tombs that are there are too early. They actually date back to the Iron Age too, so they wouldn't be the appropriate style tombs. But again, it's been a site that's been visited for hundreds, for a very long time, and so people also go and worship there. So here's the Garden Tomb. Again, Iron Age period tombs, they were multi-chambered, and the tombs themselves, the niches are side by side. The entrance chamber is very large, and so you have these multiple rooms, and they have several low benches which are actually carved into the wall. The bodies are laid on the benches. The walls are very smooth. And then once the body decays, it's about a year later that the family comes back, and the bones are moved into these openings, and all the bones are jumbled together of the family. So that individual is now considered buried with their fathers. So that's where that reference comes from. The entrance to the Garden Tomb, and there's the inside of what it looks like. So Emmaus is one of those sites where we have the sighting, the vision of the resurrection of Jesus. And so where is this Emmaus? One possible location is thought to be Emmaus, which is El Kibla. It's approximately 7.5 miles in distance from Jerusalem, versus Amwas is approximately 20 miles west of Jerusalem, heading toward Tel Aviv. So there's a lot of discourse about where this sighting actually took place, where Jesus talks to the two individuals, and then reveals who he is. So how many miles would people be able to walk in a day? Not 40, but more likely the 7.5 miles, which would be about 15 miles. And you could do that in a day's hike going back and forth. Excavations at the site itself, the one that's Emmaus, actually reveal 5 buildings, which again date back to a time when people were beginning to mark the holy sites. So that location has been a pilgrimage site for a long time. There's a house, a baptistry, both a large and a small basilica dating back to the 3rd and 6th century common eras. And then there's also a Crusader church from the 12th century. Josephus and Eusebius both refer to that location as a potential as the site. So the site that we're referring to is this one here, El Kibla, as the actual Emmaus, versus this one here at Nicopolis, which would have been far too great a distance to be able to travel that amount. So this site apparently is the most likely. You can see there were several different locations claiming to be the correct site. And that's the ancient road to Emmaus, and the baptistry that I mentioned earlier. And you have this Byzantine era Crusader basilica. So several different buildings that mark that site as an active pilgrimage site. The apse of the basilica. So in summary, when we think about God's word, we see it just doesn't stand alone. It's revealed also to us in human civilization. We experience it through all parts of our civilization. We see it in the remnants of the land, in the people, in the architecture, in the civic structures, in social structures, in religious structures, and art. And we also have God's word revealed to us in the historical records, literature, and scripture. So again, we experience God's words through the remnants of human civilization. So we understand that our God is active and present. He provides for us an everlasting covenant that engages and calls each one of us to live our lives in accordance to God's will and to carry his word forward into the world. So I hope that throughout these 4 presentations, you've managed to immerse yourself in the land and the world and the people and the culture and the society that Jesus grew up and experienced, and that the apostles lived and spread the message of God, and we watched it grow incredibly after his resurrection. Some reflection questions include the ability to walk, travel, and interact intimately with the people around him had a significant impact on Jesus' ministry. Are these opportunities readily available today in ministry? Why or why not? And 2, what impact did Roman culture have on the Jewish people that Jesus interacted with? Do you think it made them more or less receptive of his message? And can you list some cultural challenges that you face in your ministry? I want to thank all of you for participating in this class. I hope you found it worthwhile and informative. God bless you on your studies and in your ministry.